Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. As you know, for the past 2 years, the pandemic has polarized the world and our community, resulting in confusion, doubt, misinformation, and a divide that seems irreconcilable. This webinar is an attempt to initiate the conversations and dialogue toward healing this divide in our community. As a respected epidemiologist, my brother is in a unique position of being at the crossroads of government, public health policy, medical science, alternative healing, and the macrobiotic community. I am grateful to him for accepting my invitation to give a presentation of his recent findings to the community at large. I am also grateful to my friend and former business associate, Lenny Jacobs, for partnering with me and moderating this event. I am also grateful to Carl Ferre, the publisher of Macrobiotics Today, for partnering with us to help continue the conversation and dialogue after the webinar is over. Without further ado, let me turn this over to today's moderator, Lenny Jacobs. Lenny?
Thank you. And thanks to all of you who are participating in this or who have participated in this webinar. We had just under 450 registrants on Eventbrite for this event that includes people from all over the world. There are people from Czechoslovakia and Scotland, Sweden, and all over the United States. We really appreciate everybody's interest in exploring how we can understand viruses, vaccines, and how that relates with macrobiotics. Phiya and Haruo had discussed the idea of presenting some insights and perspectives, broader perspectives than what they read and what we all read in the modern popular media about how we can understand viruses and vaccines. So we decided to put together this conference, which, as you know, is no charge to you, and it's not being remunerated to us. We're not making any money on this event. This is really just a public service that we hope will provide some opportunity for discussion and insight. 60% of those of you who registered are not vaccinated. So we understand that you may have already made up your mind about the value or controversy about a vaccine. And as we all know, macrobiotics looks at modern medicine as sometimes a foe rather than a complement. So we hope that you can understand how we can bridge that gap and find a way of complementing the Western medicine, Eastern Oriental medicine, and macrobiotics. We also want to acknowledge Lino Stankic, whose 90th birthday was on February 26th. And also the February 27th, the day of this presentation, is the birth date of Haruo Kushi. Phiya and Haruo's mother would be 99 today if she were alive. So we're going to provide an hour for Haruo to, or a little over an hour now, because we have so many people signed up. There'll be an hour and 15 minutes for presentation, an hour and 15 minutes for conversation, questions, discussions, and I will field the questions once the presentation begins on during the chat that's available through Zoom. Haruo Kushi, Doctor of Science, the floor is yours.
Hey, thanks so much, Lenny, for that great introduction, and also Phiya for organizing this. We hope that this is going to be really helpful for at least having some sort of a reasonable discussion within the macrobiotic community and perhaps more broadly. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully, looks like it's disabled currently. Sorry, we probably should have checked that. Lenny, can you enable share screening for me? Yeah.
See if that works now.
Good, great. Okay, it's working now. Thanks. Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen now and the title slide. Again, I want to thank Lenny and Phiya. And as Lenny mentioned, today is my mother's 99th birthday. Well, talk a little bit more about that just in a second. Okay, so but first I wanted to start off with a bit of a disclosure, financial disclosure. I'm, as you probably saw, I work at Kaiser Permanente Northern California, which is a integrated healthcare system within the US and California. So I want to make it clear that the views that I talk about and the data that I interpret here are my own, and they don't necessarily represent those of Kaiser Permanente or any other organization with which I may be affiliated. I will point out that most of the work that I do is related to grants that I get from the National Institutes of Health, primarily the National Cancer Institute. I'm currently leading 5 such projects and a co-investigator on several others. I also co-lead an NCI-funded grant that's specifically focused on the COVID-19 pandemic. I've never taken research funding from any for-profit entities. Kaiser Permanente itself, I maybe should point out, is a not-for-profit healthcare system. I do sit on various advisory boards of one sort or another, and I thought I'd mention a couple of them that may be relevant, generally speaking, to the topic at hand of macrobiotics. I'm currently on the advisory committee for the FDA's Oncology Quality Characterization and Assessment of Real-World Data, or Oncology Q-Card Initiative. I'm also on the scientific advisory board for Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, which many of you know. That's an organization started by Neil Barnard, who's a good friend of the macrobiotic community. And I've been a member of the American Cancer Society's committees for nutrition and physical activity guidelines for cancer prevention and for cancer survivors, just to give you an idea of some of the additional activity that I've been involved in. Getting back to my parents and Phiya's parents, this is my father at the dedication of memorial for my mother, which is in her hometown in Japan, in Okuizmo in Shimane Prefecture. And this is, of course, a great dedication and recognition by her hometown that she really did have an impact on the world. And this is a memorial for my father, which is in his family's hometown in Wakayama Prefecture. And it's on the grounds of the temple that many of our ancestors, were affiliated with. And this was dedicated just before the pandemic, actually, in the end of December 2019. And so this is the temple where it is, and here's sort of a stylized map of it, and the memorial is up here, and the cemetery up above on the hill overlooking the temple grounds. And so both of these are really worth visiting if you ever are in Japan and want to visit a couple of sites that are honoring my parents and the macrobiotic movement and the worldwide impact that they have had. So I wanted to start off by talking a little bit about me and epidemiology. I'm going to touch on various topics over the course of the next hour or thereabouts. And not go into a lot of depth in any one of these. And again, underscoring the fact that these are my views and my interpretation of these various areas. But I'll talk a little bit about the pandemic, a little bit about immunology, a little bit about vaccines. I wasn't planning on talking about treatments per se, or medications, but I understand there's a lot of interest about hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. And then a little bit about natural immunity in the sense that looking at people who are actually infected, and does that provide adequate protection that instead of vaccines? And then are there things that we can do, generally speaking, but also as the macrobiotic community, and then summarize things. So just to talk a little bit about myself, since some of you may not know me, even though, of course, I've known many of you in the macrobiotic community for many, many years, decades even. So how did I end up here talking about this? So I just want to talk a little bit about how I got into epidemiology. So just sort of setting the stage, back in, when I was little, and the macrobiotic community, was robust community in Boston starting in the mid to late 60s and through the 70s and 80s. This is a position paper put out by the American Cancer Society and published in one of their journals, Unproven Methods of Cancer Management, one of a series and one about macrobiotic diets. And as they say here, the American Cancer Society would strongly urge individuals afflicted with cancer not to participate in treatment with macrobiotic diets. So I mentioned this partly because there's a real appreciation for why there may be this distrust within the macrobiotic community of sort of standard medical advice, so to speak. So back in the mid 1970s, I went off to college after going to Brookline High School. I went to Amherst College, and in my senior year there, as I was trying to figure out what I was going to do, in the future, and many of you in the macrobiotic community may remember this if you were active then. The US Senate Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs put out this document called Dietary Goals for the United States. And this was actually, I guess this came out in my junior year, but this was something that was a recognition by the federal government that what you eat makes a difference in your health. And this is kind of like what I had been growing up with in the macrobiotic community, with all these people living with us, at our home. And it was like kind of a recognition by me that, oh, maybe some of these ideas that seem on the fringe, given that many of my high school buddies and that type of thing, really didn't know anything about macrobiotics, or have much sort of general food consciousness. And partly spurred by that, I ended up going to graduate school at the Harvard School of Public Health, which is these buildings here. I spent many, many, many hours in this particular building, building 2 or building 3. Anyway, this is the Harvard Medical School sort of classical quadrangle here. This is the Countway Library, where I spent many, many hours. And when I was in grad school, even though my degree is ultimately in nutrition, my doctoral degree, I ended up taking many classes in epidemiology. And I was really fascinated with epidemiology. And when I discovered it, I basically saw it as fundamentally an ecologic and a holistic discipline, which is not necessarily how it's described in epidemiology classes, but that's basically what it is. And here's an example. This is from a paper that we had published a few years ago, looking at different factors that may result in increased likelihood or decreased likelihood of developing postmenopausal breast cancer. And as you can see, when we look at the literature at the time that we published this, each of these arrows, point to different, sort of potentially causal relationships, and the thickness of the arrows and et cetera talk about how what the strength of the association is, et cetera. But they fall into domains such as, sort of the biological, which is what people tend to think of when they think of, sort of biomedical science, but also behavioral aspects, like what you eat, physical activity that you do, the alcohol that you drink, sociocultural factors, what the context in which we live in, race, ethnicity, sort of your household income, et cetera, and also physical and chemical exposures, which are somewhat related to the biological, such as environmental tobacco or endocrine disrupting chemicals and that type of thing. So when we're looking at causality in an epidemiology sort of framework, we're really looking at the variety of factors that could potentially play a role in this case, influencing postmenopausal breast cancer. So at the same time, even though it's this holistic sort of perspective on the world, it's also a rigorous, statistically precise discipline. And here's just an example that I'll just show you, how to adjust for total energy intake, meaning calories, in epidemiologic studies. This paper happens to be my most cited paper, if that, which is a metric of how much influence one has had in the general field. And in it, we talk about different statistical methods for trying to adjust for total energy intake and how that influences interpretation of diet, disease relationships. And so at the same time, it's being very holistic. It's also very sort of precise and presents ways in which one can try and interpret phenomena that we observe in the world. And ultimately, because of these factors, and because we're studying people in their environment, then epidemiology ultimately provides the best scientific basis to guide what we do for health promotion and disease prevention. Just as an example, this is from my doctoral dissertation, but this is one of the first cohort studies, the second, to be more precise, prospective cohort studies, which is a specific type of study design, that basically found that dietary fiber intake results in lower likelihood of dying from heart disease. And this has now become a standard element in dietary recommendations for heart disease prevention. The American Heart Association recommends basically this sort of approach. They talk about more consumption of whole grains. This finding was repeated in several other studies that have been published subsequently, including much larger studies than this one. But it was one of the first to sort of help think about that, thinking about dietary factors, particularly dietary fiber, and how that influences heart disease risk. Now, similarly, in 1982, the National Academy of Sciences published this report, Diet, Nutrition, and Cancer, and it's kind of frayed on the edges because I pulled it off of my bookshelf, and I've had it since then. This was a committee that was led by, again, another friend of the macrobiotic community, Colin Campbell, and several other scientists, to basically try and review the literature and come up with recommendations related to how diet may influence cancer risk. And a couple of years later, around the same time actually as that macrobiotics report from the American Cancer Society published their first set of recommendations for nutrition and cancer prevention. And these two were fairly aligned, in terms of suggesting lower fat intake and perhaps more fruits and vegetables and a few other things like that, although it didn't necessarily use quite that language. Much more recently, I actually chaired a committee from the American Cancer Society on nutrition and physical activity for cancer prevention. This was a document that was published in 2012 with the guidelines for cancer prevention. And an updated version of this was published recently by this committee that I also served on, but was chaired by Cheryl Rock, who's at UC San Diego. And that was recently published in 2020. And basically, the recommendations are not too far from what one would characterize as, a macrobiotic type, or vegetarian type dietary pattern, although it's not specifically vegetarian. Now, it is possible that we get information wrong, because we need studies to be, findings to be repeated. And here's one that we published suggesting that vitamin E in particular, but perhaps other dietary antioxidant vitamins might decrease the likelihood of death from heart disease. When this was actually tested first, it was difficult to repeat, and then in other studies. And then second, when it was actually tested as in a randomized clinical trials, it was shown that there was actually no impact. And if anything, vitamin E supplements might actually increase the risk of heart disease. And there are various reasons why this study might have differed from those findings, but nobody, basically, we don't recommend vitamin E for heart disease prevention anymore. And, these types of studies can have sort of a popular impact, even if they end up being wrong. Here's a sort of a comic strip from of Sylvia, author Nicole Hollander, where basically she kind of riffed on the findings that we presented, and she sent me a copy of this to Larry, who saved the tuna fish sandwich, since mayonnaise is one source of vitamin E anyway. So that gives you a little bit of background on sort of where I come from and how I've sort of moved from growing up macrobiotically into conducting epidemiology research. So I'll now turn to the overview of the COVID-19 pandemic. So looking at the pandemic, I'm sure everyone's seen this type of graph. These are the number of infections, basically, number that have occurred, number of deaths. This last part is the Omicron spike, and so there's this is worldwide. Sorry, I didn't mean to have that many come up. Here's in the U.S., also from the New York Times, and as you can see, these are the people who were infected with this SARS-CoV2 virus, and this is the Delta sort of surge here, and this is the Omicron surge. You can see that people who are fully vaccinated are much less likely to have been infected, and these are deaths. We see the same sort of general pattern. The deaths are not spiking quite as high because it's been demonstrated. We have a manuscript that is, I think, in press, but I don't know. Well, anyway, submitted that basically demonstrates that Omicron is much more contagious. Well, I guess we don't specifically talk about the contagiousness, but seems much less likely to result in poorer outcomes. And just to give you an idea of the contagiousness, there's this measure called R0, which is the number of people who one person who is sick might infect. And just to give you an idea, this is the original variant. It's estimated that the R0 is about 3 people. This is the Delta variant, where it's maybe around 7 or 8. And here's the Omicron variant, which has a wide range of estimate at this moment, but substantially more infectious. It's among the most infectious viruses that are out there. Here's measles, which is highly infectious. And here's Ebola down here, or the 1918 flu, estimated around 2 people, even though that resulted in a worldwide pandemic. So we also know that the deaths, the toll of the disease has been infecting people somewhat differentially. Blacks and Hispanics have a much higher burden in terms of death rates here compared with whites. But as you can see, death rates have gone up in all race ethnicity groups in the United States. And as a result, life expectancy has actually declined by 1.8 years for the first time in many years since World War II. So, and we see that in basically all both sexes, and also life expectancy after age 65. So if you look at the different age groups, as I said, every single age group except for the very young, death rates increased in the past between 2019 and 2020, and 2021 looks like the final stats are not out yet for that, but it doesn't look like things have improved that much. If we look by cause of death, there's been mild, somewhat increases in heart disease. Cancer's been more or less the same. Here's COVID-19, which basically did not exist in 2019. It became the 3rd leading cause of death in the United States in 2020. And then these are other causes of death. And some have modest increases. This is a month-by-month sort of number of deaths that occurred in the United States. And the green line, of course, is COVID-19. There were 3 deaths in January that were attributed to COVID-19, and in some months, there were close to 100,000, and you can see that it varies a lot. As opposed to heart disease, the blue line, which, as I mentioned, #1 cause of death in the U.S., all cancers combined, is the red line, #2 cause of death. This particular one is accidents. The data are not as up to date, so to speak. This is through January 2022. And these are estimates. The more recent data are estimates, of course. As you can see, now lots of causes of death, and the decreases in life expectancy are basically attributable to the fact that we now have this major cause of death that did not exist before. Now, one of the things to note is that there's not, this cause of death is not replacing the causes of death, the other causes of death. Otherwise, you would see, compensating for these big increases, you would see substantial deficits in other causes if people were coding things separately or differently. And so we see a true decrease in life expectancy and a true increase in death rates. And that's been mentioned as something that supposedly is happening, that maybe people are preferentially coding deaths due to COVID-19 or hospital discharges due to COVID-19 or something like that. Causes of death do allow multiple causes of death. I was listening to one thing where they suggested that because there were 4 causes of death on every single COVID-19 death certificate, on that people were clearly attributing deaths to COVID rather than not. I just want to point out that there's nothing unique about multiple causes of death. This is one of the projects that I lead. It's a study of women diagnosed with breast cancer. We call the Pathway Study. And in this study as well, the median number of causes of death listed was 4. Okay, so that's no different from what was talked about in the COVID context. And so basically there's no attempt to attribute deaths to COVID-19 when they were not due to COVID-19. So in any case, a major public health problem, a major impact worldwide, and certainly in the US. A little bit about immunology. Here's an electron micrograph of the actual coronavirus, SARS-CoV2 virus. Isolated from someone who was sick with the disease. This is from the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, AID. Here's a electron micrograph of the virus particles actually emerging from a cell in tissue culture after the cells were infected with the virus. And you've probably seen, sort of pictures of the virus, sort of in the background that blurry here. This up front is the spike protein, which are these little red things that are on the model in the back. And so that's why it's called the coronavirus. In a sense, it looks like there's a corona around this. And so the American Association for Cancer Research just recently published this report looking at the impact of the pandemic on cancer research. I'm not really going to go into that aspect per se, but I stole some graphics from them, or borrowed some graphics, I guess. So I wanted to acknowledge that. So basically, when we think about immunology, there are a couple of ways in which we respond to external sort of pathogens. And there's this innate immunity, which is non-specific and fast-acting. Part of it results in, sort of inflammatory responses if you're injured, et cetera. And as I mentioned, it's relatively non-specific. You get cut, something potentially gets infected, these macrophages, et cetera, get recruited to try and, deal with that locally, et cetera. Versus the adaptive immunity, which takes longer time to respond. And this is really what, if you get vaccinated, this is what you're trying to basically help boost. This is specific for specific pathogens and specifically development of antibodies, by B cells and T cells, really help to deal with the infection or whatever it may be. And by being infected or by being vaccinated in order to develop that immune response, you ultimately also create these memory B cells and T cells. And so the next time you're exposed to those, then you can respond much quicker. So that's part of the purpose of this, of vaccination, and why being exposed can potentially protect you as well. And so when we think about this coronavirus particle, basically these spike proteins, which are basically the target of the different vaccines, they will bind to a specific receptor, ACE2, and by doing so can potentially be brought into a cell, which is this thing, this shaded particle, and sometimes if there's this coprotein, it can actually, the virus particles can actually be directly transported into the cell, but here, basically the same thing happens. It gets transferred inside this vesicle, and then the virus, which is protected out here, by this envelope can basically be let loose and hijack our protein production system, and the virus will, the RNA in the virus will then result in protein production, and then basically new viruses being created. So that's basically what's sort of happening when we're infected by this particular virus. And so what about vaccines? Well, there are basically, as far as I know, at least the ones that are currently in broad use, there are basically two types of vaccines as far as the coronavirus vaccine. There are these messenger RNA vaccines. Examples are the Pfizer BioNTech or the Moderna vaccine. I put Moderna NIH. And then there are these viral vector vaccines, the Johnson & Johnson one, and the Oxford AstraZeneca one, which is widely used in Europe but not approved for use in the US, are examples of viral vector vaccines. And basically what the mRNA ones, the mRNA that encodes for the spike protein, basically to make your body produce the spike protein, which is foreign, and then that induces an immune response. That's basically what gets injected, and then the messenger RNA to encode the spike protein, but not the virus or anything like that. Again, it sort of does what I was just describing for the virus, and these antibodies are created, which then can attack the spike proteins of the SARS-CoV2 virus. And basically the same thing happens here, but instead of the messenger RNA, there's the gene that results in coding the spike protein is inserted into a virus, a harmless virus, an adenovirus that is then injected. And then that has your cellular machinery create the, basically the gene that encodes is inserted, and then that gene will then result in development of transfer RNA, messenger RNA, the proteins of and the spike protein ultimately. So and then the antibodies are created. So that's basically the sort of what so they differ a little bit in terms of how they go. So these viruses have, these vaccines, I should say, have been demonstrated to be highly effective, at least in the short term. So this is a paper that basically was about the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine. And there were over 40,000 people in this trial. About half received the vaccine, over 21,000, half received the placebo. And the primary outcome was COVID-19, at least 7 days after the second dose. And these were doses given three weeks apart. Basically, this is the placebo group, the red line, and this is the, this is the vaccine group, sorry, the red line, and the placebo group is the blue. And this is the occurrence of COVID-19 in these groups. And basically, after the first couple of weeks, as you can see blown up here, basically, very few people in the vaccinated group developed COVID-19, whereas in the placebo group, people continued to, develop, as you can see, over, as you followed for days. And this is like amazing separation, and that's how you end up with basically an estimate of vaccine efficacy of about 95%. Yes, some people who are vaccinated do develop the disease, but not nearly at the same rate as people who don't get vaccinated. And of course, there are, local reactions. This was a short-term, relatively short-term, but typically, if you're going to have a reaction to a vaccine, it will happen in the first 3 weeks or 4 weeks. Of course, there may be longer-term impact as well that these studies don't address. But they're the typical sorts of things. And if anyone has been vaccinated with these vaccines or any other, there might be pain, swelling or that type of thing. There might have headaches, maybe muscle aches and that type of thing. And this is a Moderna thing. This shows basically the same thing. This is the AstraZeneca vaccine, a somewhat smaller study, 5,800 people in each group, but basically they show the same sort of separation. It's not quite the same level of efficacy in terms of that short-term period, but still dramatically higher than what back in 2000, mid-2000, we were hoping the biomedical community generally, were expecting to see in these vaccines. And this is the Johnson J&J, and basically looks very similar in terms of efficacy to the AstraZeneca one. Okay, so these are highly effective against infections, at least in the short term, that these studies were demonstrated to show. And that's why they've initially received, at least in the US context, emergency use authorization, for dealing with a pandemic that was killing tens of thousands of people. And so that's why these were approved for that use. And now both the Pfizer and Moderna are approved, full FDA authorization, after for adults at least. And what's in these, basically they all have, they do take advantage of recombinant, sort of a nucleotide sort of a technology. Which some people, may have questions about. And then they have various other things, many of which are actually in food products. I mean, if I saw a food label with some of these things in it, I probably wouldn't buy it, but on the other hand, it's a one-time or two-time or three-time or whatever injection at this point. This is the Moderna one, which is a little different. It does have that messenger RNA, as I said, and these have the genes that encode the spike protein. This has the messenger RNA that results in production of the spike protein as well, in a lipid capsule and some other compounds. This is the Pfizer one, which basically is very similar to the Moderna one in terms of general composition. So that's what these vaccines contain. And just so it's clear, these vaccines don't contain any virus, so you can't get infected with the SARS-CoV-2. It doesn't contain anything that can alter your DNA. That's just not possible. It doesn't contain mercury. It doesn't contain microchips. As I note here, the tech industry is doing just fine tracking you through your smartphones and all the other things that you use. It doesn't contain things that make you magnetic. They're not magnetic themselves. It doesn't contain graphene. Basically doesn't contain things that weren't listed on the previous slides, which are the ingredient list. So now, in terms of longer term safety, there is this effort by the CDC. It's been in place since 1991. CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, called the Vaccine Safety Datalink. And it basically monitors long-term safety of vaccines in a network of eight healthcare systems, including the one that I'm affiliated with, Kaiser Permanente Northern California. And it basically does this through healthcare data. So if things are not documented in healthcare system data, you wouldn't necessarily pick up a signal, but it will certainly, if people end up being hospitalized or having to come in for any sort of serious condition, then those types of things will be captured. Now, of course, these vaccines have not been around for very long, so we've only had them around for about a year. And so, so far, they don't seem to be causing major issues. Here's one particular example of an analysis. This was a preliminary analysis, but looking at spontaneous abortion rates within the 28 days after a vaccination, was there an impact? And basically, here's what that shows. This is the odds ratio. For those of you who don't know what that means exactly, this is compared to people who were not vaccinated in the 28 days. That's actually in the comparing people who were vaccinated 2 months before, basically compared to 1 month before. You would tend to think that the vaccine might have a more acute impact. So it's not exactly comparing to unvaccinated people. But in that context, there's basically no impact on spontaneous abortion rates. 1.02 means maybe a 2%, sort of very slight increased risk. This is the 95% confidence interval, which basically says that since it includes 1 in that interval, this is not statistically significant as the terminology goes. By gestational age, basically nothing in the very early part of pregnancy. If anything, it maybe even lowers the risk a little bit, but a little bit later, in the 9 to 19 week, maybe a slightly increased risk a little bit. And this is by vaccine type, basically no difference between the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, which are the major ones that are used in the US. Janssen, J&J is also used as well. Basically, ultimately, no impact of vaccination on risk of miscarriage, and with a possible suggestion of a small increased risk in the, in that 9 to 19 week period, but basically not much going on. On the other hand, when we look at the infection from the virus itself, here's an example of a study, 14,000 pregnant women, people delivered in 17 US hospitals, and comparing maternal and fetal outcomes in people who are infected with the virus versus people who are not, 2,300 who were infected and 11,000 plus who were not, people who are pregnant. And apologies for just sort of inserting the tables from the manuscript, but just looking at this, for example, hypertensive disorders of pregnancy, eclampsia, preeclampsia, et cetera. For those who are not positive for the virus, at the time of pregnancy, that's the first line, that's the reference group. And then those who were infected but were asymptomatic or had just mild symptoms, there's a little bit of an increased risk of developing hypertensive disorders of pregnancy, and those who had more severe risk had a greater risk. So there's a doubling of likelihood of having these disorders. This is the 1.0 line of basically no risk, and both of these are elevated. So overall, the infection increases the risk of pregnancy hypertensive disorders, postpartum hemorrhage, and other infections, as documented in this particular paper. And here's some neonatal outcomes. And again, taking one as an example, here's the fetal or neonatal death. So again, compared to those who are not positive for the virus, who are as the reference group, those who are asymptomatic or mild, had about a 27% increased likelihood of resulting in fetal or neonatal death, and if it was more severe in terms of the infection, about a 70% increased likelihood of fetal or neonatal death. Now, these are not statistically significant because the numbers of events are substantially smaller than in the reference group and compared to the previous slide. But overall, there's this suggestion that, if you're infected, it probably increases preterm births, which are, the next couple of slides, rows down, as well as fetal and neonatal death. So the vaccine doesn't look like, at least just in terms of short term, doesn't look like it has much of an impact, at least on spontaneous abortions, but but being infected with the virus itself clearly has some negative impact. Okay, so what about hydroxychloroquine? Again, apologies, that's a G, not a Q. And ivermectin, just briefly touching on this. Here's a systematic literature review of hydroxychloroquine, and done by the Cochrane Collaboration, Cochrane Library, which does systematic reviews of the literature, of the biomedical literature. And so here's basically what they say. And they have ways of judging the quality of the nature of the evidence using standard sort of methods for interpreting the quality of the study design, and other things like that. And so this is the hydroxychloroquine group. This is the control group and the relative risk of the two. And so the hydroxychloroquine group across 9 different studies, randomized trials, including 8,000 participants, basically statistically not significant, but if anything, an increased likelihood of dying in the hydroxychloroquine group than the control group. Not statistically significant. Negative PCR, sort of resolving the virus, basically the same in both groups. mechanical ventilation, basically same adverse events, substantially higher in the hydroxychloroquine group, but serious adverse events may be somewhat higher in the control group. So maybe a benefit there. Again, nowhere near statistical significance, whereas this one is. And there's cardiovascular effects on electrocardiogram. And this is the level of certainty of the evidence. This is very low because this is only one study, even if it was highly elevated, but very low in terms of the confidence of that, whereas the confidence that there's probably not an effect overall on overall mortality is pretty high. So overall, they said in people with COVID-19, hydroxychloroquine probably has no effect on survival and may increase the risk of adverse events. So that's their overall estimate. This is hydroxychloroquine in people who are positive for the virus, but have not yet developed symptoms, and so this is looking at COVID-19 outcomes. And again, basically these are smaller studies, and actually there's only one of each. So the level of confidence in these is relatively low, but basically, if anything, again, adverse events possibly higher in the hydroxychloroquine group, even though, it may have no impact otherwise. So basically no evidence of a positive or negative impact with hydroxychloroquine, even though adverse events might be more likely. Okay. So, and here's ivermectin. Here's a paper that literally just was published a short while ago. Randomized trial in 20 hospitals in Malaysia. The intervention group, of course, received ivermectin over a 5-day period at a couple of different doses, and then the control group was standard of care. So this was not double-blind, and the main outcome was progression to severe COVID that is requiring supplemental oxygen. And here's the basic outcomes. So progression to severe disease. So this ivermectin group versus the control group, approximately similar numbers of people. This is relatively small, again, overall, but more progression to severe disease in the ivermectin group than the control group. So increased risk, again, not statistically significant, but you can see the mechanical ventilation, needing that, actually lower in the ivermectin group, again, not statistically significant. So the study is relatively small, so it really doesn't lend too much. You can't put too much weight on it, but on the other hand, basically, and what the author said, the findings do not support the use of ivermectin. It's probably underpowered to be able to address it, but certainly doesn't indicate that there's a major benefit necessarily at this moment from this study. Now, there have been systematic literature reviews of this, and this was one that was published which suggests, as they said, borderline significant effect on duration of hospitalization in comparison with standard of care, a beneficial effect. This was published last year, but the meta-analysis was retracted after there were some problems in the actual studies that they were reviewing. And so they republished this, and basically they ultimately, addressing the biases and possible medical fraud in a couple of the studies. And so this is effect on survival using ivermectin when you included all the studies, but then if you excluded those that were fraudulent, and fraudulent included, for example, repeating the same data for a number of people in these studies twice, including deaths that occurred before the study actually started, and some other things like that. So excluding those studies, and then looking at studies that appear to have bias. For example, the randomization didn't really result in the two different groups looking similar, which is basically what randomization is supposed to do. And there was still, substantial differences between the two groups that might be biased in favor of better survival in the ivermectin group. Excluding those, then you basically result in not too much difference between the two groups. So the evidence from higher quality studies regarding ivermectin basically possibly a beneficial effect. There are other studies going on that will hopefully provide, more definitive information about this, beyond the one that I just showed from those ones that were reviewed. Okay, so what about natural immunity? Okay, now this hasn't been studied that much as far as I know per se, although and so we took a look at it partly for this project, for this presentation in some of our data, and I'll say that some of the information I'm going to show is not published, and so really shouldn't be cited and that type of thing. But as introduction, I'm currently involved in a research project that's part of what the National Cancer Institute has funded, called the Serological Sciences Network for COVID-19, or SeroNet for short. And there are 25 different funded research projects and centers, and the NCI hosts a central laboratory, and a number of institutions around the country are involved in this. And so the project that I'm involved in is this particular one, understanding the role of SARS-CoV2 serological antibody testing for disease surveillance and clinical use. My good friend and colleague, Jacek Skarbinski, he's an infectious disease epidemiologist and clinician who actually treats people who are infected with these diseases. He's the lead on that. And just to give you a little bit of background on Kaiser Permanente, it's this big integrated healthcare system in Northern California, covers about 4.5 million people. The H's on this map are the hospitals, 21 hospitals in the network, over 250 outpatient clinics. We're all on connected electronic health record system. I'm in the division of research. About 70% of our budget comes from external funds, grants and contracts. And we have about 60 researchers here. So our SeroNet grant basically was focused on prevalence of antibody seropositivity, and then trying to look at long-term sort of antibody, sort of response, and then in people who we actually are explicitly measuring antibodies, and then using the healthcare system in AIM3 to basically look at different aspects of the infection and the pandemic, et cetera. And so there's a little bit of detail here, but I'll just say that we looked at, in this particular analysis that I'm going to show, we looked at people who were infected during the Delta and Omicron variant time periods, basically between July and early January, in terms of when we closed the data for analysis. Obviously, we're still accruing information, et cetera. And then for this analysis, we split that up into these different groups. People who had no prior infection and were not vaccinated, about 40,000 of those. And these are all people who had documented infection with SARS-CoV2 ultimately. And that's how they got into the study, so to speak, or how we identified them. So there are people that prior to that index infection, we didn't have any evidence that they were infected and were not vaccinated. There are some people who did have a prior infection, and so that's natural immunity group. Then there are people who are vaccinated and had the complete series, so a single Johnson & Johnson vaccine, or 2 doses of the Moderna or Pfizer vaccines. About 52,000, or some people who also had a booster, about 12,000, and then people who had some other sort of mix of vaccines, or got AstraZeneca because they were in Europe or whatever. And so that's a mix and a little harder to deal with or interpret. Now, we also adjusted for a number of other factors, I should say, including receipt of some of these treatments. And I do want to point out that some of these are repurposed medications that are available, that are used for other purposes, like tocilizumab for rheumatoid arthritis or whatever, but has been approved for use for COVID-19. Dexamethasone, L-cheapo, sort of steroid medication, that's also, this tocilizumab is not, but dexamethasone is, and is approved for use in COVID. Remdesivir is a new drug, antiviral. And so basically, here's let's just focus on this hospitalization group, for example. So this is the no infection, no vaccination group as the reference category. These are people who were the natural immunity people who did not have any prior infection. They had about half the likelihood of becoming hospitalized. But then people who were vaccinated had an even more dramatic lowering likelihood of being hospitalized. And then if you had the booster, it was even more so. And then there's sort of the mixed bag sort of vaccinated group who maybe had only one dose of Pfizer, or whatever. And these are a couple of other endpoints basically showing the same thing. And here's death, basically showing the same thing. So yes, if you get infected, sort of naturally from the virus, you do have subsequent future protection, but at least in the time period that we were looking at here. But being vaccinated, it has a greater effect. And in order to get to this part, the red part, you need to go through the blue part, so to speak, because you don't get because these are people who are not vaccinated and didn't have evidence of prior infection. Of course, we confirm things like age makes a big difference. Then there's hospitalization, 11-fold likelihood of dying if you're 80 plus compared with those who are, in the 18 to 39 age group, much more likely to die. There's body mass index, this is so increasing body mass index, increasing likelihood of hospitalization or death. No, these are comorbid conditions, cardiovascular disease, cancer, COPD, diabetes, et cetera. They all increase the likelihood of hospitalization or death or those other endpoints. This is a comorbidity index that's often used in studies that are based on healthcare data. So the higher the burden of comorbid conditions, the greater likelihood of being hospitalized or dying. And so basically, yes, natural immunity, so to speak, being infected previously makes a difference. But vaccination provides substantially greater protection. And of course, widely recognized risk factors, now widely recognized, we see the same thing. So is there something we can do? And so that's sort of the next question. Are there things that we can do? Okay, so as I mentioned, the AACR published this this monograph on COVID-19 and cancer. And like I showed, with our postmenopausal breast cancer paper, looking at sort of the whole constellation of factors, we recognize as a biomedical community that there are so many different factors that influence the likelihood of developing disease, or once you have disease, impacting outcomes from the disease. And so that includes socioeconomic factors and clinical factors like access to healthcare or whatever, environmental factors, where you live, it seems to make a big difference. Several of my research projects are focused, incorporate that as part of what we're looking at, in addition to like healthcare data and SES and stuff. Cultural factors influence, likelihood of, various behaviors that might influence likelihood of developing diseases, et cetera. There's potentially some underlying genetic factors, but as some people have said, your zip code is a lot more important than your genetic code in terms of predicting, outcomes, et cetera. And of course, having other health conditions, et cetera, as we see with COVID, makes a big difference. So here's one example, physical inactivity, okay? This is conducted in Kaiser Permanente, Southern California, and likelihood of severe outcomes in 48,000 people. And so when you come into an outpatient visit in Kaiser Permanente in Northern and Southern California, you're asked a couple of questions, along with questions like, do you smoke? Do you drink alcohol a lot? And that type of thing. And so one of the questions, these questions that are asked for exercise as a vital sign, as it says, is on average, how many days per week do you engage in moderate to strenuous exercise like a brisk walk? And on average, how many minutes do you engage in this exercise at this level? And so that's asked every time you go in for an ambulatory care visit. And you can take that information that's recorded in the electronic health record and basically classify that into people who are consistently active, at least the way they did it in this particular analysis, 150 or more minutes per week. And those are people who, that meets the recommended level by the American College of Sports Medicine and other groups. Some activity, or were consistently inactive less than 10 minutes per week. And as I mentioned, it was KP Southern California members, 48,000 people who had at least 3 of these assessments and also had a COVID-19 diagnosis. And so looking at outcomes from that, this is comparing, these are the consistently active group. As you were less active, you were more likely to be hospitalized, more likely to be admitted to the intensive care unit, more likely to die. So clearly, even though these are all people who were infected with the virus and all actually had a diagnosis of COVID-19, these downstream outcomes, are more likely to occur if you're not physically active. And so when we think about some of the other things that we know about the development and progression of infection, we know that people who are more overweight, or obese, more to the point, or have conditions like diabetes or heart disease that we know are impacted by physical activity and what people choose to eat, then that makes a big difference. So here's another example: diabetes prevention program. This is not COVID related. The rest of this is not directly COVID related, but in this particular study, we see the placebo group had the poor cumulative incidence of diabetes, and then these 2 interventions. Okay, and I'll skip over that. But if we unmask what the interventions are, that's metformin, a widely known and used diabetes drug, and lifestyle intervention, which is basically moving towards a plant-based diet, et cetera. It wasn't vegetarian or macrobiotic per se, but clearly lifestyle has a bigger impact than a standard diabetes medication in terms of diabetes incidence. And so this, again, and I won't go over the details of what the study design was about, but clearly dietary factors, lifestyle interventions can make a big difference in terms of development of diabetes. Here's the DASH study, which has looked at basically plant-based type diet on blood pressure. And as you'll notice, one of our old friends, Frank Sachs, who used to be part of the macrobiotic community, was part of this. And he had done these early studies in the macrobiotic community, published back in the late 1970s, early 1980s, looking at different effects of cardiovascular risk factors in the macrobiotic community. And they developed this diet that was partly inspired by that, called the DASH diet now, dietary approaches to stop hypertension. And here are some of the main findings. This is just systolic blood pressure impact, but as you can see, the control diet, systolic blood pressure basically didn't change much. The fruit and vegetable diet, basically, the dietary interventions basically decreased, blood pressure as they were being followed. Here's a more recent study looking at Mediterranean diet, the PREDIMED study, published about a little less than 10 years ago now. Mediterranean diet interventions, again, these aren't vegetarian necessarily, but clearly show that these dietary interventions decrease heart disease relative to the control diet. And this is a cardiovascular disease endpoints. This is overall mortality. Basically, it's showing some sort of a more modest impact, but still an impact. So just to summarize, here's the National Cancer Institute building in Rockville in Maryland. And they moved in there, I can't remember, 15 years ago or whatever. And I was there not too long after they had opened up for a meeting related to one of my studies. And if you recall, I start off with this American Cancer Society document, Unproven Methods of Cancer Management, Macrobiotic Diets. Well, I went to the cafeteria and look what was on the menu. Macrobiotic stir fry, was on the menu in the cafeteria there. And here's the person, doing the quick cooking. Yeah, and depending on how you define macrobiotics, maybe some people will say, oh, what about these little tomatoes or whatever? But that was, what was there. Here's the prepared dish. It was delish. And so macrobiotics, it's become, even if it's not well known, it's become mainstreamed. Here's my mother and me way back when. And as Lenny mentioned, she's today would be her 99th birthday. And she was a great spirit for my family and for the macrobiotic community overall. Really was championed sort of community and happiness, and and I miss her, as I'm sure many people do. But kind of thinking about that, this is something that I sometimes end things with. We sometimes get very focused on illness, and this I borrowed from Dean Ornish. So anyway, and if you think about that, it's really focusing on the I, on one's individual self. But if we change that to focusing more about thinking about the community, and sort of what we're doing, then it's really, we move from illness to wellness, and so I want to say thanks. From that perspective, I will say personally, I am vaccinated, including booster. Now, I'm not necessarily, sort of here to try and convince you that that's what you should do, but I feel that it's partly out of public health responsibility for this major pandemic, but it's also an expression of love for our community. It's an expression of, sort of really trying to, sort of care about the people who we interact with and who we're with and who we live our lives in social, sort of communion with. And so people can choose to do other things, but I feel like that's the motivation for really trying to do a lot of this. Anyway, thanks. Hopefully we have a lot of time for discussion, etc. And I obviously only touch things, but anyway, okay. So I'm going to stop sharing and turn it back over to Lenny and Phiya.
Okay.
Great.
Hello.
Thank you very much. Phiya is going to do a small presentation now, and I've turned the chat on. So again, if you would chat to the host, unless there's a friend that you want to connect with, but Phiya's on, and then I'm going to introduce another one of our longtime friends. Go ahead, Phiya.
Okay. Hi. Sorry. Hello. I'm going to, as you know, we did a survey in conjunction with this webinar. What I can show you is the multiple choice or single choice report from those from the survey. The other questions, which were all text-based questions, will be summarized, and Carl Ferry is doing a tremendous job summarizing these questions, and will be reported in Macrobiotics Today, and everybody who also participated in the survey as well as in this event will get a summary. We'll get a link to the summary of the survey that we put together. But right now, I'll just show you the 3 slides of this of the single and multiple choice survey questions. So just here we go. Let's see. One second. Okay, hold on. Here we go. Okay. Okay, can you see this slide? When does this show up?
Yep.
Okay, great. So this is just the 3 questions that were multiple or single select choice. So here we are, the countries, 283 persons responded to the survey. As you know, there's a lot more on the call, but who registered to be on the Zoom conference, I think over 400. But this is 280 respondents. Most of the people are from the United States, and then Netherlands, Belgium, etc. Okay, then Profession was multiple, choose all that apply. So there are 423 responses because people chose multiple responses. The macrobiotic educator counselor was 49, student of life 122, macrobiotic cooking instructor 38. And you could see these, that's that. And then the last choice was if people had taken the vaccine.
I'm getting questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Have you taken a vaccine for COVID-19? Of the 277 people responded, and 60% said no. Then of those who did, the largest group was the Pfizer vaccine, and then Moderna and Johnson & Johnson. So, and that's it. These will be added to the summary that Carl is preparing and will be published in Macrobiotics today. I think that's all I have to say. Thanks.
You had some other comments, though, didn't you, that you wanted to make?
No, that's okay. I think I'll leave it at that for now. I did prepare a kind of a statement of a more detailed and full analysis of the situation that I will be I'm submitting to Carl Ferre to publish along with the information regarding this this webinar. So that information will be there. Some of my thoughts, including some of my thoughts on viruses and vaccines and how macrobiotics relates to them. I mean, I will mention, for example, the origins of vaccines actually go way back to ancient China and India and the Middle East, and later it was specifically with regards to the smallpox, and it was using the disease. It's the basic principle is using the disease to repel diseases, which I thought was an interesting idea in terms of how it kind of aligns with macrobiotic ideas. Anyways, that is just some of the things I've looked into, but more I was looking at our division and why and how to heal the division that is in the community and in the world. So that's in my essay that hopefully Carl will publish. And if not, it'll be also on my blog as well. So that's all I really should say.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah. So, okay. I'll turn it over back to you.
I know there are many questions coming in. One of our longtime friends and macrobiotic educators, Denny Waxman, had some things that he wanted to present, and we appreciate everybody else's comments. We'll try to get to some of them, but Denny, if you'd like to take the floor or the screen, as it were.
Thank you, Lenny, and Hal and Phiya. I appreciate the opportunity to speak. I was intending to sit here quietly, but a number of friends said maybe you should speak up. So I asked both Hal and Lenny if I could have 5 minutes. And so I'm speaking as a friend, but mainly as a macrobiotic teacher and counselor who's basically, well, I'd also like to say, I'm not anti-vax or anti-science. I'm really for personal health choice, and I have no problem if anyone chooses to be vaccinated themselves. What I do have a problem with is mandates that force people to comply to keep their job, or coercion or shaming to try to force people to get it so they can see their family and loved ones. For that, I do have a major issue. Actually, it's my longtime dream to merge macrobiotics and science. I think, 10,000 years of history and human experience combined with science can create a new medicine for the future. So I'm speaking really from my own. So looking at core macrobiotic principles, spending more than 50 years trying to, penetrate, reinterpret, and disperse macrobiotic principles, I came up with self-reliance and self-responsibility. creating an exciting and creative life, living with joy and gratitude and sharing with others, living free of fear. But I don't find anything about vaccines or self-protection. And so I just don't really see personally how vaccines fit in with the macrobiotic way of life. Now, of course, there's a different view. And since listening to Haruo, I thought vaccines are safe and effective. There's no other treatments for them, and I should run out and get a vaccine after this. But my gut and experience tell me different. So I'm not going to do that. From what I've been able to gather, COVID-19 is less dangerous than a common flu, so especially for young people. And age and comorbidities are the biggest risk factors, which I'll point out. Now, what I would like to propose, it's not age nor comorbidities. It's the diet and lifestyle that cause these things over time, which naturally increase with age. And I have a number of clients in their 60s, 70s, 80s, and even one in the 90s, unvaxxed, who have had COVID and have passed through very successfully. And I don't know if I've had it or not. I usually get my seasonal cold or flu, which I had this year. I don't know what it was, but I'm still here to talk about it. But I think since we have such a unique diet and lifestyle, to promote that as wellness and sharing for the community and world would be the best effect for health and sharing, these basic principles we're so much a part of. Now, the question about natural immunity, to me, whether it's the bubonic plague or the 1918 pandemic, some people died, but not everyone died. That means some people are doing things differently. And you might say, well, they weren't exposed, but I think there's other factors that are in our control. Now, whether the vaccines are safe or not, I know in the early trials, they seem to be safe, but so many medical treatments, we don't know for 3 to 5 years, and in some cases, until the next generation, as in DES, diethylstilbestrol, or thalidomide, especially. So I think only time will tell how safe they are. Then my biggest point I wanted to make is, I've spent most of this last 2 years an inordinate amount of time trying to study everything I could from the mainstream and alternative literature about this, and listening to many doctors who have basically gone over the other side, very prominent doctors and researchers. So there's a whole different story there. But my question is this: what if the reports are true about all of the blood clots, neurological problems, especially Guillain-Barré, myocarditis and pericarditis, increase in cancer, especially breast and lymphoma, reproductive issues, sterility, and a general weakening of the immune system? So my question is, what if those things turn out to be true? We know diet and lifestyle are the safest, most effective for health and longevity, for well-being, for everything that we're talking about and interested in. So what if the concerns voiced by many people, including people who claim they were vaccine injured, turn out to be true? So to me, that I don't gamble. Tried and true is basically the approach that, yes, and I'm coming up to the end. I appreciate the time to speak. And what I would like to say, I am grateful to COVID for creating a renewed interest in health and self-responsibility. I mean, the difference I've seen in my counseling practice, and especially in SHI, and just the general response and interest to macrobiotics has grown dramatically over the last 2 years. So for that, I'm greatly appreciative of COVID, and thank you for that time. Appreciate it.
So of course there are a lot of questions. I think Lenny will be moderating, but I want to thank Denny for actually speaking out a little bit. I do want to make it clear, and I perhaps forgot to say this explicitly, but I think macrobiotics has so much to offer, in this context. My implication that, physical activity, as that Kaiser study showed, and these other studies have shown that, diet makes a big difference in terms of cardiovascular disease and diabetes, et cetera, is to basically say that, the things that we teach as a macrobiotic community, in terms of the importance of, lifestyle choices and diet in particular, but lifestyle choices more generally, makes a big difference, and so it's not that there's not really a conflict between sort of taking the best of evidence-based medicine and the best of traditional and evidence-based macrobiotics per se, and so it's not that there's a conflict, it's that they really sort of work together in a sense, or can work together if one chooses to. Now, one can choose to be a skeptic about certain types of things, as people seem to be expressing in some of these things, and that's okay if you choose to live your life that way, and make those choices. That's something that some people will choose to do. They will choose to listen to things that they may hear on social media over what's actually published in sort of reputable medical journals, and that's okay too, I suppose. Ultimately, COVID-19 clearly is a disease that's much worse than the annual flu that we get. There's approximately 30,000 or so people who die every year from the flu in the United States. That's nothing like the 350,000 that died in 2020 in the US from COVID-19. It's an order of magnitude difference. It's a different disease. Now I'm not going to speak specifically about the wisdom of mandates or anything like that. That's a sort of a different sort of thing, but I will say that if people were vaccinated, there wouldn't be a need for mandates. So it's, so it's like, I don't know, it's just, it's clearly something that, I talk with people who are on the front lines of healthcare, in the emergency room, or treating people, through their infectious disease specialty, et cetera. And I'm not them. I'm not on the front lines. They clearly are devoting a lot of their energy and effort and their heart and soul into really helping people, regardless of whether they've been vaccinated or not, regardless of, et cetera. And part of what we want to do is we want to help alleviate that concern, so anyway, I agree that, long-term impact, we really don't know. Obviously, the disease has only been with us for 2 years, and the vaccines have only been with us for 1 year, so it's really hard to know what the long-term impact will be, so we can't predict the future in that sense, but from everything that we know from it seems like it's much safer. Yes, it's not 100%, sort of protect against, either getting infected or the disease, et cetera. But yes, it's clearly, a problem that is hopefully we'll be able to, live with. Anyway, we can turn it back over to Letty. Sorry.
Thanks. One of the questions that has been coming up is just about other types of things. You mentioned hydrochloroquine and ivermectin, but there are other things that people have recommended. I don't know if you have any experience with like vitamin D supplementation or zinc, or some of the mushrooms that are being recommended. There's been questions about those other factors that might increase natural immunity.
Yeah, so I personally have not, looked into every single one of the things that people bring up. I don't know if Gordon Sachs is on, but I know that he's actually leading some projects, looking at certain mushrooms, because of their potential, immune boosting effects. And so there's clearly interest in, trying to look at some of these things. I'll say that,
there hasn't been sort of a conspiracy of trying to shut down, sort of medications that might show promise. In fact, there are ongoing studies that are looking at, existing medications to see if they can be repurposed. That's where we get dexamethasone, being approved. But then there are others, and there are studies ongoing, for example, looking at ivermectin, for example. So it's not that there's an attempt to try and shut those down necessarily, but really trying to go where the evidence shows. Yeah. So anyway, yeah, vitamin D. Yes, I think vitamin D is generally a positive thing. It's one of the few supplements that are out there that I think potentially has health benefits. As I mentioned, vitamin E, unlike how we reported once, probably it's not doesn't have much overall health impact. So probably doesn't hurt, but at least not in a major way. So
some people wondered whether the vaccine reduces natural immunity. If in fact that,
yeah,
if they've been infected with coronavirus and then had the vaccine, is that going to lower their natural immunity?
Yeah, I don't think that's the case. I think if anything, it'll. I don't know that it's synergistic per se, but I think that it will. It's additional protection. I mean, regardless of what sort of the immune boosting or immune challenge, sort of stimulus you receive, whether it's from actually being infected, or getting the vaccine. I mean, they are a little different, obviously, but I think, both of those will work and in concert. So if you've been infected naturally, then get the vaccine, you're probably in better shape than just one or the other, so to speak, in terms of, negative impact downstream from the virus per se. So. Yeah, and vice versa. If you're vaccinated and then you get infected, which does occur too, so.
A lot of the evidence of the coronavirus or COVID infections comes from PCR tests, apparently. And there's some questions about the accuracy of those PCR tests if there's not an increased amount of false positives that imply coronavirus, COVID infection, even though that may not be the case.
Well, the PCR tests are really pretty specific to the virus. And false positives are pretty rare. The antigen tests, that's another thing. Those might be a bit more, false positives show up there. The PCR tests usually take a little bit longer and that type of thing, in terms of getting the results. But they tend to be pretty accurate. So, yeah. And of course, not everybody who's infected will get the PCR test, and not everyone who's so we don't really know sort of the full scope of the pandemic from that perspective, but and there is a bit of a bias, so to speak, in the data that we do have in from the perspective that if you do get hospitalized, you're going to get a COVID test, you're going to get a virus test, and so but not everybody who's just walking around in the street or whatever maybe feels like they have a cold or, a mild fever or something, or necessarily going to get tested. So, and then obviously people who are asymptomatic, they're much less likely to be tested. So there is a bit of a bias in terms of what we do know in terms of who's tested. So.
Yeah. What about the evidence of side effects? I know you mentioned a little bit, but apparently there are some databases that show large numbers of people with side effects from the vaccines.
Yeah, so the side effects, obviously there are the local initial side effects from the vaccines. You get pain, where you get vaccinated, etc. And then you have some other sort of more systemic side effects, that might last a couple of days, you get a fever perhaps, etc. Now there is this thing called the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System that the CDC put in place. It's been in existence for a couple of decades, and basically what it is, it's kind of like the same thing that we have in place reports that Consumer Product Safety Commission has. If you have a problem, you can report it, whatever, with a product, and so basically anything that anyone can report something, and anyone, and so that can be reported to the CDC. And part of that is for an early warning signal, for things that perhaps could be looked at in more rigorous detail in something like the Vaccine Safety Datalink that I mentioned. But the vaccine adverse event reporting system is just that. It's just people reporting things that may or may not be related to being vaccinated, but may be worth further investigation under, and we have no idea, sort of what the overall sort of context in terms of that reporting happens. It's essentially a bunch of anecdotes that might provide important signals, but are not evidence in and of themselves that those particular things are actually due to those vaccines. And so it's a way for the CDC and scientists to basically follow up on these signals that might be there. So, but in and of itself, it's important to not sort of take it for more than it is. So.
One thing a number of people have mentioned, I just want to clarify, I don't know if it were sarcasm or actually an interest, but none of us are being paid in any way. And Haruo Kushi is not being compensated for anything from any of the vaccine companies or pharmaceutical or anybody. We've spent time preparing for this, providing for this platform, and really it's of, we hope, public value and not for any personal gain. So just to clarify that.
Yeah, I unfortunately, some people are, I mean, one of the things that I mentioned at the beginning, but as a matter of principle, I never take any grant funding from any for-profit entities. That's not true of most of my colleagues, but I've never done that. I've been in situations where I've seen, people sort of gone after when I was at the University of Minnesota, by the tobacco industry or by the egg board, because of publications that they've published that basically suggested that cholesterol's not so good for you and cigarette smoking's bad and that type of thing. So one thing I'll say is that macrobiotics has so much to offer to the world. And I think everyone here probably recognizes that. And some of you have been leaders in terms of really trying to do that, and dedicating your lives to that. And I really sort of applaud all of you and really feel like you're my, brothers and sisters and, sort of my spiritual guides in a sense in the work that you're doing, and I really feel like, you're at the front lines in a lot of ways. But there are things that the macrobiotic community has done that has really stunted our ability to have an impact. For example, for the longest time, I'll say, cigarette smoking was widely accepted in macrobiotic communities. And I could never understand why, with this overwhelming evidence that cigarette smoking is detrimental to your health. It's actually on the same order of magnitude right now as, the number of deaths from COVID in the United States anyway. Several 100,000 deaths due to cigarette smoking, still occur in the United States on the same order of magnitude as the deaths that have occurred in the past 2 years from COVID. And yet, macrobiotics, you'd go to macrobiotic community gatherings and people would be smoking. I mean, that, you used to say, smoking stunts one's growth. Well, it certainly stunted the growth of macrobiotics.
Okay, no.
And so I think that there are things that we do as a community where we're not open to, sort of other ways of knowing or other types of evidence that, unfortunately, unfortunately, it limits our ability to have an impact as a community. And I wish that, we sometimes would be much more open to, sort of approaching communication in a more loving manner. So.
Thank you. Another one of our long-term friends and long-term teachers of macrobiotics, Bill Terra, has a few minutes that he would like to speak if everybody is okay. I'm going to let him make his presentation, and we'll continue to ask a few other questions. Thanks, Bill.
Oh, thank you very much, Lenny, and thank you, Haruo, and Denny and Lenny and all involved. I don't have really a presentation, but I have a couple of things that I'd like to say. One of them is that macrobiotics has always stood for body autonomy. It's one of the main principles that's there in George Osawa's work, is primary and Micho's work, and that's a hard road to hoe. That means that you have complete control over what people put into your body, what you put in your body. And that kind of autonomy is very, very important for understanding macrobiotics. And when I listen to what's been said here, and I respect the source of the information and the sincerity behind it, I have no problem with anybody making any decision about what they want to put into their body. But really we've been talking about is a great experiment. There's no certainty about any of this. And I'm going to kind of telegraph a few things because I don't want to eat up a lot of time. But when we say that there's been no suppression of treatment using already approved drugs, that's just simply not true. Doctors all over the world, or doctors, I'll just stick with America and England, many of them at the beginning of the COVID pandemic had protocols, and they were using protocols, and some of them were getting success, and then they were outlawed. So to say they're not being used, to being experimented with in hospitals is one thing, but for doctors to actually make a choice how they treat their parents, this is a new breakthrough. And what we're looking at here is an authoritarian control of medicine. And this is put forward now. The World Health Organization is debating whether there should be a worldwide network involving every country that's in the World Health Organization for how we approach a pandemic and how we control the situation. And that, to me, is the absolute antithesis of macrobiotics. So I would love to have a situation where Haruo or anybody who is involved in the scientific community were together with other people who are involved in the scientific community, like the virologists and the epidemiologists that are putting forward a completely different picture, but are actually canceled out. No question about it. In fact, wait a minute. Some of them canceled out so badly that they have to go on bloody Fox News in order to get interviewed. And that's not a fantasy. That's a reality, and I'm sure that you know that. Yeah. So it's forced into alternative presentations, and that is bullshit. That's not science, and that's not good for anybody, and it's certainly not good for the macrobiotic community. Because if we're about anything, we are outliers, and we're trying to press into new areas of understanding about health and society. And we're not doing anybody any service by going along, bending over and saying, okay, well, yes, we all should get vaccinated, right? Which is just really silly. I mean, people need to make choices. They need to make choices. And that's it. That's a God-given right. Make your own choices.
Yeah. So Bill, I will just say, I don't disagree with you at all. So I'm all for personal autonomy, but I'm for it in the context of actual knowledge and real facts. And so as I mentioned, I'm not really going to go into mandates, et cetera. That's sort of very different, in terms of what's the disease, what sort of impact is it having, what sort of public health impact, what are appropriate ways of potentially being able to deal with it. And as I said, macrobiotics has so much to offer in this context. It does. And you're one of the people who's doing that, and I really respect that, so I'm not saying anything about that, and I totally support that. I don't support, and I feel it almost pains me in my heart when people take information and twist it in ways that are not true, and that's what really sort of pains me about this whole pandemic, Is no, and you talk about people being silenced, but they're not silenced because you've heard from them. You hear from them from Fox News. You hear from them, from, I mean, otherwise, how would you even know about them? They're not silenced, I mean, yeah, maybe someone gets banned off of Twitter or something like that, but that's very different, yes, and there are instances, sure, I mean, if you want to practice medicine, is it more that, I mean, and of course, there are many things, that's practicing medicine. I mean, I'm not a clinician, as I said, so take all this with a grain of salt. And as I said, there's all my personal views as well, but it's there's definitely an art to it, and so there needs to be this ability to, make choices based on your best knowledge, but so people may have protocols, and there are good reasons to think that some of these medications that are that have been looked at, might have been helpful, like hydroxychloroquine or whatever, but has not been supported by actual research that's been done trying to look at the impact. Okay, so that's the problem, of continuing to, support that kind of thing. Now, ivermectin, I think, is a little different. The evidence, is currently a little relatively weak. And there are definitely, as I've mentioned, drugs that are being repurposed, for this purpose, for dealing with this. So it's not like that's totally off the table and we're only looking at, new medications or whatever, that pharmaceutical companies are therefore going to be making lots of money off of, which some people have talked about. I'm not blaming you. I'm not saying you have talked about that necessarily, but that type of thing, there are specific, contexts in which those are being done. I mean, Gordon is Sachs, I mentioned, I don't know if he's on, but he's doing these studies on mushrooms. He's not being silenced, from trying to do that, which is like definitely out of the mainstream, so it's not, so it's, I think, anyway, I just think that sort of seeing medical knowledge as an enemy and being anti that, as is expressed in some of the comments that I see scrolling by my screen. And that, again, that's not exactly what you said either, and so perhaps I'm mischaracterizing, but I think that there's knowledge that we, and experience that we don't incorporate into macrobiotics if we have a closed view.
Thank you. Some people have asked about Novavax.
Yeah, I don't know much about Novavax. It's been approved. It's being used in only 2 countries. So I don't know much about that. Yeah. So I can't really comment on that. Sorry. Yeah. So I will say, vaccines, are known to the ones that are currently in use, particularly the mRNA ones, do appear to have a waning immunity effect. Partly, so that is something that we want to determine, whether that, is it going to be something ultimately like, the flu vaccines, which have to be given every year because there may be new variants and that type of thing, or is it going to be something, like, chickenpox, where, I mean, it's definitely not going to be something like, some of the vaccines where if you get it once, then you pretty much have your lifetime, protection, so, yeah. So.
Could you say anything about your particular approach to natural immunity? What do you do?
Yeah, so of course, I largely eat macrobiotically, whatever, in terms of food choices. I perhaps less so in terms of food preparation, since I pretty much live alone. And so, but certainly the food choices I make, tend to be, sort of standard macrobiotic diet, whatever type sort of choices, variety of, and that type of thing. I try to be pretty active physically, which means, sort of being out, on weekends, going for hikes, commuting to work by bicycle, whatever. I think that's really important, to be reasonably physically active. But I don't, for example, take specific, sort of medications or whatever, or supplements or whatever, vitamin D, for example. I don't take vitamin D. I don't take zinc, whatever. So I will also say, way back when we were going to school, as my brothers will recall, we all got smallpox vaccinations. My parents had us get smallpox vaccinations. Way back then, it was required. This was before smallpox was eradicated. When I was in Japan in the when I was in college for a year, I wanted to travel back from Japan sort of the long way instead of flying back to, from Tokyo to New York or whatever. I decided to go what was then the hippie trail, the Asia overland route, and so traveled through to Taiwan, Southeast Asia, India, Nepal, Afghanistan, Iran, Turkey, and stuff by train and bus, and a couple of short plane hops. And at the time, I was wondering, should I get cholera, sort of vaccines before heading out and stuff. And I asked my parents, and they encouraged me to get cholera, sort of get that protection. And so I did, before I left Japan. Yeah, it's so there's nothing sort of antithesis to macrobiotics regarding getting vaccines, necessarily. I agree with Bill about the sort of bodily autonomy, that one should have some reasonable freedom to choose what one does with oneself. so it's I think that, like he said, it's an important principle, but sometimes there are things that we do that would be good to, sort of incorporate other knowledge from other places, that we don't necessarily, as a community, sort of look to, so.
There is also a question, just, as you said about smallpox, that smallpox seemed to be a vaccine that helped eradicate smallpox, as polio and maybe even measles have. What is it about the coronavirus that is not eliminated through the vaccine?
Yeah, so of course, one of the things that has been of a lot of interest just generally is the fact that there are different variants that seem to have occurred pretty quickly. So there was a much more sort of, in terms of severe outcomes, the Delta variant, that was popular last summer, and then the Omicron variant, which seems to be a lot more infectious, but less sort of less virulent, so to speak, more recently. So that's one thing, as viruses replicate, they can, create different variants occur, and then vaccines that are designed for specific, sort of specific genetic sequences, so to speak, of what the vaccine is made of, will potentially become less effective. So that's part of it. But part of it also is the fact that it's pretty clear that the coronavirus really comes, is not just harbored in us as humans, but can also be harbored in, there are now reports of, deer, for example, and, other, animals that have, are pets, dogs, and have been infected with the coronavirus. The evidence seems to suggest that it most likely originated in bats or something like that. So it's going to be difficult to, eradicate the virus because it has other reservoirs, so to speak, species in which it can reside, with varying sort of immunologic and sort of health effects for those animals. And so, and from what we know, and what's most suspected is that there was some sort of jump from, the wet animal markets and to humans, and so, and there's certainly that's happened before, and so anyway, so smallpox was very different in that it was only in humans where it could exist and live and replicate. And so it was possible to isolate people and, if someone was infected and vaccinate everyone who they had been in contact with, etc. That's what the whole WHO program for smallpox eradication was based on, and it was successful. So yeah.
Michael Rossoff is another longtime macrobiotic counselor and acupuncturist and Chinese herbalist. He had some things that he wanted to mention or ask.
Mm-hmm.
Michael, are you there?
Yes. Hi, and thank you for the chance to talk. Hi. I want to just, based on what Haruo just said, I really want to emphasize his last point that smallpox and polio only exist within humans. It's not coming from the animal kingdom to humans. And whereas coronavirus is able to come from the animal kingdom to human, which makes it much more new to us and much more volatile and can mutate and such like that. I guess what I want to say, just one point to something Bill said, and it's kind of a subtlety. Yes, we do have absolute choice of what we put in our bodies and how we make impact in our lives. But we also have to be clear that our environment, like coronaviruses and other viruses, exist in our world right now, right around us. We are never out of the viral world. And so it's really about our inner integrity that will make a big difference. And on that score, I want to say that I wrote an article that was in Macrobiotics Today a year ago on how, should you take the COVID vaccine, and I really discuss all the vaccines, the 4 main ones, and what else can be done than just taking vaccines. And before that, I had written an article preparing for the coronavirus, and these are both on my website. And in that, there's a lot more about food, some Chinese herbs that everyone can easily get online that can help build up immunity and strengthen things. Because underneath it all, it's really about inflammation and our blood condition, if we want to look at it from a kind of Oriental medicine point of view. And in that regard, there's a lot we can do with our diet to keep that level of inflammation down. And there's supplements like vitamin D and zinc and some Chinese herbs that can all we can benefit from. I think I have taken the vaccine. I took the Johnson & Johnson. And to tell you the truth, after 2 weeks, I thought I had a symptom, a side effect, and I was very nervous. Turns out I didn't, but because it was pretty dramatic, so I sudden change in my strength of my legs. And it turns out it's really a disc problem that I have had that triggered that. It just coincided, it seemed. But my real point is that we're in a different world. We're in a very toxic world where we don't have control over all that's out in that world. And I think that's triggering a lot more viral and bacterial activity. And we need to look at ways that we can ensure and support our body's ability to respond quicker, because the response is where the danger is. And the response is an inflammation when you get a cold, which is a coronavirus, or worse, COVID-19. So that's my main point, and I thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Before you go, Haruo, one of the things people have been asking about being able to reconnect, I mean, this is sort of like a international digital reunion of many friends and teachers, and we have an email list of everybody who signed up for this. We're not going to share it with everybody, but we will give you the opportunity of including your name in a shared list, and if you would like to. maintain connection with your friends all over the world, all over the country. It'd be really great. I see so many people that I haven't seen in face-to-face, even without the pandemic. We also had some interest among some of us to do some kind of a study like what Haruo mentioned, the population of macrobiotic people. And although Haruo had in the past applied for grant money to study the lifestyle over a period of time of macrobiotic practitioners, macrobiotic vegetarian people, that's something that we also might be able to engender through this group of like-minded and eager people to confirm the value of the life that we've chosen, the principles that we're following, the food that we're eating, and how it impacts our mortalities, our health conditions, as well as infectious diseases, whether we're vaccinated or not. And certainly none of us here are in favor of forcing anybody to do anything about what you eat, what you wear, what you're injected with. And we are certainly looking at somewhat of a libertarian viewpoint about that, and yet trying to get the balanced view from looking at different points of view. And here we are. We have gone on for, like I said, a half hour longer than we had initially planned. And I know a number of people still would like to ask questions. I'm going to give the final words to Haruo, but again, this conversation will continue if you like to through Macrobiotics Today. Carl Ferre has generously offered to make his publication, his digital publication, an opportunity for a platform to continue this conversation. And if we like, we did take some money out of our own pockets to fund this this day, and we took some hours out of our life to prepare for it. We're glad to do it if it's going to be of public good. And we don't want to encourage divisiveness. We want to encourage some kind of integration. And we understand that we're only going to get there through the dialectics of two different yin-yang points of view that we hopefully will complement in the long run with a viewpoint that will really engender health and prosperity and well-being for all of us. So thank you, Haruo, and we'd like you to say the final words here.
Yeah. So first, my name is Haruo, by the way. No, I'm not correcting you, but I just noticed that Gerard put a little comment. How do you pronounce Haruo? So anyway, not that it really matters. So first, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. It was so great to see the names and actually hear from some people who, I've known for years and years and years and decades, but have not connected with, not just in the past 2 years, but in many, many years, in one way or another. And yet, you're all people who I've always held in high regard with and a lot of respect. I hadn't really talked with Lenny much, before preparing for this. And also getting the invitation from Phiya, was a bit of a surprise when that first happened. I'm glad there was a lot of interest and also a lot of varying opinions. I'm really, it's unfortunate that we haven't had an opportunity for everyone to be able to express, their questions or being able to address everything, that has been mentioned, but really appreciate the fact that people are willing to, sort of both be here as well as, sort of express their views and their questions that they may have. I think that, we all become richer, as a result from this dialogue. I hope that, we somehow are able to continue, and, thank goodness for technology like Zoom webinars, that allow us to connect in this way. So much thanks to Lenny and for moderating, and I hope that everyone comes away with this, with a bit more of a smile on their face and a little more of a positive attitude toward things. So thanks so much for everybody for joining us.
And just a final happy birthday again to Lino Stankic, who I'm not sure if he was able to join us or not. And also to Aveline Tomoko Kushi, without whom none of us would be here, or at least not Phiya and Haruo.
Yeah, for sure.
And, and thank you all. And we hope to meet again.